Hello everyone, this is Joshua Alvarez coming to you again with another Sabbath sermon. Today we're going to be talking about the subject of common excuses for rejecting God's law. Common excuses for rejecting God's law. And as you can see in the title of the sermon, I have 3 of those common excuses listed right out. Mixed fabrics, tattoos, and sideburns. Before we go into the reading of the Word of God in the Holy Scriptures in the King James Bible, we'll go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for this day today. Thank you for the ability to open your Word and to see what it has to say for us, and to see how it can correct us and correct our behavior and correct our wrong thinking so that we can obey you and do that which is pleasing in your sight. And I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Common excuses for keeping God's law. Common excuses to not keep God's law. When a Christian is faced with the plain statement of Jesus Christ in Matthew 5:17-19, that he didn't come to destroy the law but fulfill it, and that we ought to keep even the least of the commandments of Moses, they often give a knee-jerk response. And this knee-jerk response is essentially firing off, well, what about this law? What about that law? Do you keep this law? Do you keep that law? They give a knee-jerk response, pointing to the commandments that they don't expect you to follow. And of course, what the Christian expects to hear from you, because they hear this from other Christians, is, no, I don't keep those commandments, or those aren't for today. So that they can go, aha! So if you don't keep all those strange commandments that disagree with our culture, then I don't have to keep the commandments either. Do you do this? Do you do that? Well, the answer should always be yes, or else if I don't, I repent and will start doing those laws. The Christians picked up this argument from the Sodomites, who use it against Christians, saying, how can you quote Leviticus 18 at me to condemn men lying with men, when the law also condemns eating shellfish and pork? Well, God's law says that to lie with mankind as a man is abomination. Well, the Bible also says that pork and shellfish are abominations. Do you keep those laws, Christians? And so the Christians have simply parroted from the Sodomites, from the abominable people who break God's law, because that's what Christians do, and adopted it against those who want to keep God's law. Do you keep this law? Do you keep that law? If you don't, then I don't have to keep any of it, except the ones that I want to. How can you quote Leviticus 18 at me when the law condemns eating shellfish and pork? How can you quote the laws on eating shellfish and pork if you mix fabrics? If you have a tattoo, if you cut off your sideburns? Today we're going to be looking at 5 common excuses that Christians give for rejecting obeying Jesus Christ. Christians don't follow Jesus Christ. They are marked by disobedience to Jesus Christ and hatred of Jesus Christ's teachings. If Jesus Christ were on earth today, the Christian church would refuse to let him preach in their pulpits, and they would condemn him as a heretic and try to crucify him again, or at least burn him at the stake like a good Roman Catholic would do. Jesus taught the Father was the only true God, not a Trinity. Jesus taught that unbelievers will perish and not live forever in eternal conscious torment. Jesus taught that God the Father has a physical shape and location, and that you ought to keep all the commandments of Moses. No Christian follows Jesus Christ. A Christian means someone who does not follow Jesus Christ. That's why I don't call myself one. I don't want to be associated with them. But unlike the Christians, we Nazarenes will follow Jesus Christ in everything that he taught, including obeying God's law. So now let's look at the common excuses Christians throw at you to discourage you from obeying God's law. The first common excuse is mixed fabrics. Mixed fabrics. Turn to Leviticus 19:19. Leviticus 19:19. Leviticus 19:19. Ye shall keep my statutes. Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind. Thou shalt not sow thy field with mingled seed. Neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon thee. That last part particularly is what Christians pick up on. Neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon thee. Turn also to Deuteronomy 22:11. Deuteronomy 22:11. Deuteronomy 22 verse 11. Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen together. And so Christians will read these verses and say, if you're wearing a cotton polyester shirt, you're breaking God's law and have no business telling me to keep the law. But what did the law actually say in these verses? The law only condemned mixing linen and wool, not all fabrics. That's what those verses said that I just read to you in Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:11. They only mention mixing linen and woolen together. You're not to do that. The law doesn't condemn mixing all fabrics. It only condemns mixing linen and wool. There's no cotton or polyester mentioned here. The commandment is very specific. Leviticus says don't mix linen and wool, and Deuteronomy, which means a second giving of the law, affirms the same thing. But you say, well, that may be the case in Leviticus, but in Deuteronomy, it says, thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen together. It says as of. So that has to mean more than just linen and woolen mixtures. That's not so. The phrase as of in the King James Bible just means meaning, as in Galatians 3:16. Let's look at an example of this. Galatians 3 verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not as to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Well, the phrase as of, you could substitute the word meaning in there. It would mean the same thing. In your mind, at least. Of course, not changing the words of the Bible, but showing how it's used. He saith not unto seeds as of many. In other words, when God told Abraham, I'm making this promise to, Paul is saying that God did not promise this promise to Abraham and to his seeds, which would mean many. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but God promised unto thy seed, meaning one. But as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So the phrase as of, it means meaning. It doesn't mean that, well, this is one example of it. Okay? So when you read in Deuteronomy 22:11, thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts as of woolen and linen together. That's simply saying, don't wear a garment of diverse sorts, meaning specifically, don't mix woolen and linen together. Okay? And it makes better sense that way, because otherwise, what would be the point in God commanding specifically in Leviticus, don't mix linen and woolen, only to later say, hey, don't mix anything? So no, God's law only condemns mixing linen and wool, not all fabrics. And again, as Deuteronomy is a second giving of the law, that's what Deuteronomy means. it makes the best sense that this is simply repeating that prior law in Leviticus. Don't mix linen and woolen together. So do you wear mixed fabrics? Well, yes, I do, but the law of God doesn't condemn mixed fabrics. It condemns mixing linen and wool, and I don't wear a garment mixed of linen and wool. I may wear a garment mixed with cotton and polyester, but that's not the same thing as mixing linen and wool. Let's look at the second excuse that Christians give for keeping God's law. Tattoos. Tattoos. Do you have a tattoo? Leviticus 19, verse 28. Leviticus 19:28. And before I read this, it's kind of unfair to demand, assuming tattoos are a sin. It's kind of unfair to demand someone who is obeying God's law to not have tattoos. Because what if they got that tattoo before they started obeying God's law? You wouldn't condemn another Christian who says that they repented of their sin of fornication by saying, have you ever committed fornication? Well, since you have, then I guess it's okay. No, they repented of that. And you should keep that in mind. So even if tattoos were a sin, you can't say, aha, I see a tattoo on your arm, therefore I can break God's law. What if they repented of that? You don't know when they got that tattoo. It's a very uncharitable, ungracious attitude. But of course, Christians are not really known for their grace. They're known for their dogma of keeping the traditions of men. But regardless, let's go to Leviticus 19:28, the verse that allegedly condemns tattoos. Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Do you have any tattoos? I personally don't have any tattoos. In the past, I have gotten some of those fun little watercolor temporary tattoos as a kid, but I've never gotten a real tattoo. But this verse tells you what tattoos not to get. It's specifically about tattoos for the dead. I'll read it again. Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. All that's one sentence. All that is talking about the same thing. Either cutting in your flesh or printing any marks for the dead. Is the tattoo honoring or serving the dead? If it is, then you don't get it. But if it's not for the dead, then it's perfectly fine in God's law to get a tattoo. Jesus has a tattoo, but without any issue because it's not for the dead. Look at Revelation 19, verse 16. Revelation 19, verse 16. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh, notice, he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, Jesus there has a tattoo on his thigh at his second coming, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's not for the dead, so it's fine. It doesn't break God's law. So, do you have any tattoos? What if you have a tattoo? The law of God doesn't condemn tattoos. It condemns it for the dead, for honoring or serving or worshiping the dead. Let's look at our third common excuse for keeping God's law, or against keeping God's law. Sideburns and beards. Turn to Leviticus 19:27. Back to Leviticus. Leviticus 19:27. Ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. And the Christian will say, do you shave off your sideburns? Do you cut your beard or trim it? Where does the commandment mention sideburns? It says, "Ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard." What do you read sideburns in that? The commandment doesn't mention sideburns. All the command says is to not round the corners of your head. That refers to cutting your hair on your head to be round like a circle. That's referring to something like a bowl cut. Cutting off the sideburns doesn't round the corners of your head into a circle. You get that from Jewish tradition, that it means to not cut off your sideburns. But the hair on your head is still not round, even if you cut off your sideburns. It's just not. So that's not what that commandment is about. And this command doesn't say to never trim or cut your beard either. What does it say? It says, "You shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard." To mar means to destroy or to cause to perish. Turn to Mark 2:22. Mark 2:22. What does it mean to mar the corners of your beard? Mark 2:22. "And no man putteth new wine into new bottles, else the new wine doth burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles will be marred. But new wine must be put into new bottles." Compare this with Luke 5:37. Luke 5:37. "And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish." Mark says the bottles will be marred. Luke says the bottles shall perish. To mar the corners of your beard means to entirely shave off parts of your beard so that the beard is no more. It perishes. The law doesn't condemn trimming your beard, but shaving parts of it off. Under the law in the Old Testament, trimming the beard was allowed, and it was expected, and not trimming your beard was considered odd or unusual or unkept. Look at 2 Samuel 19, verse 24. 2 Samuel 19:24. 2 Samuel 19:24. "And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came again in peace." Notice how trimming your beard, that's grouped alongside other unkept behavior, like not dressing your feet or washing your clothes. So that wasn't part of the command. Otherwise it wouldn't be listed like that in that kind of context. So you can trim your beard short as a man. You just can't shave off or mar parts of it. Let's look at the fourth excuse Christians give for not keeping God's law. The issue of menstruation, or a menstruous woman. Recently, a sweet and gentle pro-life activist, Roman Catholic woman by the name of Kristen Hawkins, screamed and yelled down at a couple of Christians, telling her that she should endorse God's law on abortion. If that sounds strange, I encourage you to look that up. Papists hate God's law. All the talk from papists about setting up a Christian nation and Christian nationalism really just means making up their own Christianity as they go and rejecting God's law. That's why I'm not a Christian nationalist. I am a theonomist. I am for enforcing God's law, not a Christian nation. And one of Hawkins' objections to God's law was, because what was happening in this conversation, or rather this shout-down from this pro-life Roman Catholic activist, was that, like all pro-lifers, she was trying to argue that we should have compassion on the mothers that murder their children and should not prosecute them as murderers according to the law of the land. which that is an inconsistent position in God's law, because God's law says that anyone who kills another person, they're to be put to death. And so a mother that murders her children by an abortion, under the civil law, should be put to death. That should be what the civil law is. Just like any other murder is punished by the civil law, a mother who murders her child should also be punished by that same civil law. That's a matter of consistency with both the law of the land and also with God's law. And the Christians were arguing that with Kristen Hawkins, this pro-life activist, and she was shouting them down saying, "Oh no, that's evil, that's disgusting. No, we need to have compassion on these mothers who murder their own." And one of Hawkins' objections to God's law was, quote, "Do you think when I'm like menstruating, I should be on the other side of town because I'm unclean?" Unquote. That's a verbatim quote of what she said. Well, God's law never says a woman should go to the other side of town when she's menstruating, Kristen. Christians simply try hard to make God's law unbearable or discourage Bible believers from keeping it. They're doing the work of Satan when they act like this, when they try to make God's law so unbearable, so ridiculous sounding that nobody would want to keep it. That's the work of the devil. That's not the work of God. It's the work of the devil to keep you away from obeying God's commandments. God is never going to take you away from his commandments. But what does God's law say about a menstruous woman and about going to the other side of town? Let's look at Leviticus 15. Leviticus 15, verses 19 to 24. Leviticus 15, 19 to 24. "And if a woman have an issue is older English for a flowing out. And if a woman have an issue, and her issue in her flesh be blood, she shall be put apart for 7 days. And whosoever toucheth her shall be unclean until the even. And everything that she lieth upon in her separation shall be unclean. Everything also that she sitteth upon shall be unclean. And whosoever toucheth her bed shall wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even. And whosoever toucheth anything that she sat upon shall wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even. And if it be on her bed, or on anything whereon she sitteth, when he toucheth it, he shall be unclean until the even. And if any man shall lie with her at all, and her flowers be upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days. And all the bed whereon he lieth shall be unclean." There is nothing here about going to the other side of town if you're menstruating as a woman. All it says is that she must be set apart. That can be in her own room. And it doesn't even condemn a man for having sex with her in that state. It would just make him unclean too, and have to be set apart for 7 days. Now, anyone who touches her in those days is commanded to take a bath. So the sin would only be in not taking a bath if you come in contact with such a woman. It wouldn't even be a sin to touch her. Just keep yourself clean with a bath afterwards. And for the woman, she stays apart during those days so that she doesn't become an inconvenience to anyone who comes in contact with her, and now they have to take a bath. But you don't have a woman being commanded to go to the other side of town. You don't even have it as a sin to touch such a woman or to come in contact with her. It just becomes a little bit of an inconvenience. You got to take a bath. Plus, these commandments are only applicable in context when God's tabernacle is among you. Look at Leviticus 15:31, same chapter. "Thus shall ye separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, that they die not in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them." God's tabernacle isn't among us. It was among Israel in Jerusalem, And it's not even among them right now because they don't have any temple. So these commandments, these requirements to take baths whenever you have a nocturnal emission or a menstruous woman, they aren't even applicable right now. Not because we don't have to keep God's law, not because I'm cherry picking here and there, but because the purpose of these laws is to not defile God's tabernacle when it's among you, and his tabernacle isn't among us. When his tabernacle is among us, then you better take these baths, as prescribed by these commandments. And besides that, it is only best hygienic practice to take a bath, as these laws command. So it's even good to keep these commandments as a matter of practicality, even though God's commandments are not among us. You say, what about Leviticus 18, verse 19? Doesn't that say it's a sin to have sex with a menstruous woman? Let's look at that. Leviticus 18, verse 19. Also, thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. You have the same thing commanded in Leviticus 20 and verse 18. If a man shall lie with a woman having her sickness, and shall uncover her nakedness, he hath discovered her fountain, and she hath uncovered the fountain of her blood, and both of them shall be cut off from among their people. Well, that's the death penalty. What is this talking about? This is not condemning having sex with a menstruous woman. This is condemning uncovering the nakedness of a menstruous woman. What does it say again in Leviticus 18, verse 19? Also, thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. That refers to the fact that a woman's male head, or her husband or her father, is her covering. Look at Genesis 20, verse 16. Genesis 20, verse 16. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes, unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. Sarah's husband, which was also her brother at this time, Abraham, he was her covering because he was her husband. If a woman is under a husband or still living with a father under his roof, that man is her covering in the Bible. And to sleep with her behind his back is uncovering her nakedness. And if you do that with a menstruous woman, that's a sin worthy of death. But apart from uncovering, from putting aside a woman's male covering to sleep with her, it's not a sin to have sex with a menstruous woman, such as with your own wife. Again, we just read in Leviticus 15 how if a man lie with her at all, he doesn't get put to death, they're not cut off, he's simply unclean for 7 days. So don't twist the scriptures to try to make God's law unbearable when it's not. God's law here simply condemns uncovering, putting aside a woman's male covering to sleep with her when she's menstruating. That is a sin that's worthy of death. Let's look at our fifth example. Fifth example of supposed unbearable commandments that nobody keeps in God's law. Stoning rebellious kids. Turn to Exodus 21:17. Exodus 21:17. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. You say, oh, how can you say that we should stone rebellious kids? Would Jesus stone rebellious kids? Actually, Jesus would stone rebellious kids. Turn to Matthew 15, verses 3 and 4. Matthew 15, verses 3 and 4. You want to be so much of a Christian, you reject the words of Jesus Christ if you make this kind of argument. Matthew 15, verses 3 and 4. This is Jesus talking. But he answered and said to them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and thy mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. Jesus affirmed this, and he rebuked the Pharisees for going against this commandment of God by their tradition. What do you think Jesus would say to the modern-day Christian church? And it's not to all rebellious kids either. This command is specifically about cursing your father and your mother. It doesn't say you put your kids to death just because they're rebellious. If a kid disobeys you, that just merits a spanking. That's what the book of Proverbs says. But this command is a command for when a kid curses his parents. That's a deep level of disrespect beyond simple rebellion or disobedience, and God's law absolutely condemns it to death. And Jesus Christ condemns it to death. And Jesus Christ rebukes anyone who would overturn this commandment of God for their tradition. However, that penalty is commanded to the judges and officers to execute, not for the common people. Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. The command to enforce God's penalties in the law is required for the judges and officers in the land, the civil authorities. You are not obligated or commanded to mete out God's civil penalties yourself apart from the civil authorities. In fact, Jesus said that you should keep the laws of the land that you live in as a simple matter of avoiding their wrath. Turn to Matthew 17, verses 24 to 27. Matthew 17, 24 to 27. And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter, and said, Doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, Yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children, or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, Of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, Then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast an hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take, and give unto them for me and thee. So, should we stone rebellious kids? Well, it's not commanded to us to stone rebellious kids. It's commanded to the judges and officers, the civil authorities. We're not obligated to mete out God's civil commandments. But if you're a judge or an officer, if you're a civil authority, that is your obligation, and you should be doing everything in your power to bring back and enforce God's law. In conclusion, God's law isn't difficult to keep. The basic core heresy behind these Christian objections to the law is that the law is too hard to keep, so you can't even keep them, supposedly. Well, God's law is not hard to keep. God's law is not a burden that's impossible to obey. It's impossible to obey sinlessly, but it's not impossible to obey in general. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. Don't let Christians discourage you from keeping God's law. Whenever they try to throw at you, well, the law says this, do you do that? A lot of the time, they don't even understand God's law or what it actually says. But those of us who read and believe God's law, for those of us who read and believe God's law, the right answer is always, if God's law says it, then I do it. And if I don't, then I repent of my sins and should start doing it right now. God bless you, and I pray you have a wonderful rest of this Sabbath day.